The aftermath of World War II. Did the United States learn from past mistakes at the end of World War II? Introduction. When Japan announced its surrender to the Allies on VJ Day, the U.S. newspaper headlines, the United States shouted the news. Factories and offices shut down, and Americans poured into the streets in celebration. With hugs and smiles and joyful tears, they expressed their relief over World War II's end. Throughout the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, soldiers shouted, "It's over." The war's end caused jubilation in the United States, but it also ushered in a period of uncertainty for the nation. One writer noted that some Americans even seemed to fear the coming of peace, because wartime productivity had lifted the country out of the Depression. Americans worried about the post-war economy. When the government stopped granting large military contracts, would the Depression begin anew? Many people recalled that the economy had collapsed after World War I, increasing inflation and unemployment and spreading crime and social tensions. Americans now feared potential repeat outcomes. Foreign policy sparked even greater concern because victory entailed the responsibility of maintaining peace. The Senate had refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, so the United States did not join the League of Nations. Other victorious nations used the Treaty of Versailles as a way to punish Germany, a course that helped lead to World War II. Would the United States now take a leading role in world affairs? If so, how would it choose to treat the defeated nations, particularly Germany and Japan? President Franklin Roosevelt realized that the importance of these questions as early as January of 1943, when he declared, "Victory in this war is the first and greatest goal before us. Victory in the peace is the next." Roosevelt did not live to see either of these victories, but his hard work and pragmatic view of the world helped prepare the United States to fulfill its post-war obligations. Millions of U.S. Servicemen were eager to return to civilian life after the war. When they returned home, many were greeted with open arms. However, the transition from wartime to peacetime also created challenges for numerous Americans. The end of isolationism. When President Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations in 1918, Franklin Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had high hopes for its success. The Senate had ratified the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States had become a member of the League of Nations. Had the United States ratified the Treaty of Versailles and become part of the League of Nations, perhaps the League would have challenged Germany and helped prevent the actions that led to another world war. Now that World War II had ended, would the United States revert into isolationism, or would it assume a stronger role in world affairs? The United States leads the creation of New World organizations. In the years leading up to World War II, Roosevelt quietly fought against isolationism. After Pearl Harbor, increasing number of Americans realized that the United States could no longer isolate itself from the world. To achieve the security, the nation had to cooperate with others and maintain peace. This shift in attitude enabled Roosevelt to direct the country toward a policy of internationalism. Late in the war, he pushed for the creation of new worldwide organizations that would help prevent future wars by promoting stronger economic and diplomatic ties among nations. In July of 1944, representatives of the United States and 43 other nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where they jointly founded the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank. The bank was designed to provide loans that would help countries recover from the war and develop their economies. Much of the bank's funding was financed by the United States. These nations also established the International Monetary Fund. The IMF's goals were to stabilize the global monetary system and establish uniform exchange rates for foreign currency. Predictable exchange rates would support international banking and trade. 3 years later, 23 nations further encouraged trade by signing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, in which member nations agreed to lower tariffs and eliminate barriers to international trade. The United States also cooperated with its allies to create a replacement for the League of Nations. In the fall of 1944, representatives from the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union gathered in Dumbarton Oaks, in a state in Washington, D.C. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull opened the meeting by saying, "It is our task here to help lay the foundations for which after victory, peace, freedom, and a growing prosperity may be built for generations to come." This conference resulted in a draft charter for a new organization called the United Nations, UN, and in June of 1945, 50 nations signed the UN Charter. In seeking approval for the League of Nations, President Wilson had worked hard to win public support and thought he did not need the support of Republicans in the Senate. In seeking support for the United Nations, Roosevelt did not make this same error. Not only did Roosevelt speak to the public about the need for nations to learn to work together for peace and security, but he also worked to persuade Republican senators. Although Roosevelt did not live to see the results of his efforts, in July of 1945, 3 months after his death, the Senate ratified the U.S. membership in the United Nations with a vote of 89-2. The United States gets organized. The United States was a leader in founding the United Nations. Its influential role is evident in the UN. Come on, dogs. United Nations Roosevelt four essential. He identified these four freedoms in a speech in January of 1941. In that speech, January 1941. In that speech, he discussed a world in which people would have freedoms of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Freedom of speech, expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of worship, want, fear, expression, worship, want, fear. The world order which we seek, he said, is the cooperation of free countries working together in a friendly, civilized society. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill incorporated the four freedoms into the Atlantic Charter in August of 1941, a significant expression of the Allies' post-war goals. 4 years later, UN Charter framers referenced the Atlantic Charter and the Four Freedoms when devising the framework for the United Nations, the fundamental human rights in the dignity of worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. To reinforce these principles, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1948, the document affirms basic human rights, including the right to life, liberty, and equality before the law, as well as to freedom of religion, expression, and assembly. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chair of the Declaration Drafting Committee, compared its significance to the U.S. Bill of Rights and other essential documents. The UN Charter also detailed the structure of the United Nations. General Assembly is the main body of the United Nations, consisting of all member states. The Security Council, a much smaller but more powerful body, consisted of 15 member states, 5 of which are permanent: the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China. The Security Council focuses on issues of peace and security and can use military power to enforce its decisions. Each permanent member can veto any Security Council resolution. The United Nations faced one of its first challenges in 1947, originating from the crisis in Palestine, a region on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Jews, many who had migrated to the area to escape Nazis, wanted to establish their own nation there, a desire that Arabs in the region vehemently rejected. Violent clashes resulted from the unrest, after which the United Nations decided to partition Palestine, dividing it into Arab and Jewish territories. In 1948, Jews proclaimed the State of Israel, and the first of several Arab-Israeli wars followed. Tensions would continue for years to come. 2. Dealing with the defeated Axis powers. Even before World War II ended, Allies faced important decisions regarding the future of defeated Axis powers. A generation earlier, the World War I victors had imposed a harsh peace on Germany. The resentment among Germans, Adolf Hitler used this resentment to fuel his rise to power. Recalling the mistakes made after World War I, Roosevelt was determined not to let history repeat itself. War crimes trials. Allied demands following World War II were considerably lenient compared to those at Versailles. Germany and Japan had to disarm and surrender conquered territory, although they did not have to pay reparations. The Allies did not demand a great deal of money from them. Instead, reparations were ordered in the form of industrial equipment as well as other goods and services. Roosevelt explained this approach in his last address to Congress in March 1945. By compelling reparations in kind, in plants, in machinery, in rolling stock, railroad cars, and in raw materials, he said, we shall avoid the mistakes that we and other nations made after the last war. Allied leaders did not want to punish the people of Germany and Japan after World War II. Rather, they chose to leave the countries with enough resources to remain independent. The Allies sought only to punish German and Japanese leaders who had committed war crimes or violations of internationally accepted practices related to waging war. Roosevelt delivered his statements shortly after returning from Yalta, a Soviet city on the Black Sea. There he met with Churchill and Joseph Stalin to begin discussing punishment for war criminals. 5 months later, at a meeting near Potsdam, Germany, President Harry Truman agreed with the other Allies to hold fair and open trials for Nazi war criminals. These trials took place at Nuremberg, Germany, in front of an international military tribunal. The judges and chief prosecutors of the tribunal or court originated from the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. The American prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson, presented the opening statement of the trial. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations flourished with victory and stung with injury stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. The 22 defendants of the Nuremberg war crimes trials included leaders of the Nazi Party, the military, the SS, the Gestapo. The SS were the elite Nazi Party corps, most infamous for running the concentration camps, while the Gestapo were the Nazi secret police. These leaders were charged both with war crimes and crimes against humanity, including persecution and extermination, to which they all pleaded not guilty. On October 1st, 1946, 12 defendants were condemned to death by hanging, 7 received prison terms, and 3 were acquitted. Other trials occurred thereafter. Those convicted of war crimes included officials who ran concentration camps, doctors who conducted gruesome medical experiments on inmates. A separate tribunal met in Tokyo in 1946 to try Japanese war criminals. The trial, which lasted for 2 years, found 25 defendants guilty, 16 received life sentences, 2 received lesser sentences, and 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. The final group included Hideki Tojo, Japan's leader during much of the war. From enemies to allies, rebuilding Germany and Japan. The Allies also worked to restructure Germany and Japan after the war. At Yalta, they decided to divide Germany into 4 military occupation zones, one for the United States, the USSR, France, and Britain. While Berlin lay entirely within the Soviet zone, it too was divided into 4 parts, one for each occupying power. Allied bombers destroyed numerous German cities during the war, and many Germans continued to suffer from famine and disease as a result. The United States did little to help rebuild Germany at first, concerned primarily with dismantling German factories to eliminate the country's war-making capacity. Later, American policy would shift to focus on restoring Germany's economic health. The Allies approached post-war Japan differently, placing American General Douglas MacArthur in charge of the country. Although Allied soldiers occupied Japan, they did not directly control the country as in Germany. Instead, the Japanese government implemented political reforms that MacArthur and his staff prescribed. After dissolving Japan's empire, disbanding its military, the Allies worked to introduce democracy in Japan. Officials under MacArthur prepared a new constitution that established a parliamentary government based on the British model, with a strong legislature and an independent judiciary. The emperor would only have ceremonial powers. Both women and men could elect representatives to parliament, and civil and political liberties were ensured by a lengthy Bill of Rights. The Constitution also stated that the Japanese people will forever renounce war, and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. The United States first sought to weaken Japan's industrial economy, like they did with Germany. By 1948, however, U.S. officials had decided to promote economic growth. Japan began the difficult task of rebuilding its ruined cities. In 1951, Japan, the United States, and 47 other countries signed a peace treaty that restored Japan to full sovereignty or independent authority. 3. Americans adjust to post-war life. Americans adjust to post-war life. The mass cancellation of government contracts had thrown many Americans out of work after World War I, and demobilization of millions of soldiers contributed to this unemployment crisis. So after World War II, American leaders made efforts to ease the difficult transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. From soldiers to civilians, the impacts of the GI Bill. President Roosevelt was already making peacetime plans 3 years before the end of the war. In a September 1942 radio broadcast, he spoke of economic crisis following World War I to an audience that included American soldiers abroad. Roosevelt promised, "When you come home, we do not propose to involve you as last time in a domestic economic mess of our own making." 1 year later, Roosevelt asked Congress to pass the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or more commonly known as the GI Bill of Rights. This bill dedicated federal funds to ease returning GIs' transition to civilian life, helping many returning war veterans continue their education and buy homes. Congress unanimously passed the GI Bill in the spring of 1944. 5 months after the war ended, the U.S. Armed Services had released 8.5 million men and women from duty, and several million more returned home. The following year, many veterans took advantage of the GI Bill to enhance their civilian life prospects. With the bill's assistance, some 2.3 million veterans attended college, while 7 million received vocational or on-the-job training. The middle class expanded as veterans became doctors, lawyers, teachers, and other types of professionals. Veterans also took advantage of low-interest federal loans to purchase homes. By 1955, the government had granted 4.3 million home loans through the GI Bill, enabling millions of Americans to move from city centers to surrounding neighborhoods. Instead of being renters, they became homeowners. The GI Bill had other benefits. It provided unemployment compensation for returning veterans. GIs could also take out cheap federal loans to fund new farms and businesses. The effects of the GI Bill were not limited to the individuals it directly helped. Rather, the legislation helped transform society. African Americans seek new opportunities. The GI Bill heightened the expectations of all GIs, including African Americans. Shortly after the bill became law, the National Urban League stated that returning black GIs would want jobs, opportunities to complete their education, a chance to go into business, and the privilege of sharing completely in the future development and prosperity of the nation. Not all African American GIs were able to take full advantage of the bill's benefits. Discrimination often prevented African American veterans from buying a home, even if they had enough money. Segregation kept them out of many colleges. Still, in the years following the war, many African Americans became homeowners through the GI Bill. Thousands more received college education, mainly by attending historically black universities. The end of the war did not slow the migration of African Americans from the South. In fact, returning veterans seemed especially eager to leave. By 1947, some 75,000 black GIs had left the South in search for jobs and better life. In total, 2.5 million black Americans migrated from the region in the 1940s and 1950s. In the post-war years, African Americans' lives generally improved. From 1947 to 1952, the median income or average pay for non-white families rose by 45%. Politically, the outcome was more varied. In national elections, most African Americans supported Truman, who in turn encouraged civil rights progress. Yet in the South, discriminatory state regulations prevented many African Americans from voting. The demobilization of women from factory jobs to the service sector. Not all war industries had been shuttered by 1947. Women who had volunteered to work in shipyards, aircraft plants, and other war-related jobs received their final paychecks as millions of GIs returned from the war. This set up a potential conflict, pitting men and women against each other for the same jobs. In the post-war period, most female workers felt a duty to give their jobs to men. Even though they had been reminded throughout the war that their jobs were only temporary, many women enjoyed the independence and self-esteem they received from holding a paying job, so they wanted to continue working. They are the women, a reporter commented, who feel that they are good enough to serve in a crisis. They deserve a chance to earn a living in peacetime. These women did earn a living, but not through a job in heavy industry, which went mainly to men. Instead, many women took jobs in the booming service sector, the segment of the economy that does not produce goods. They became teachers, nurses, librarians, bank tellers, and social workers. On average, women in service sector jobs earned just over half of what men did, but for the most part, women accepted their new role and economic status. For Freedoms, United Nations, Nuremberg War Trials, GI Bill of Rights.